The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Red Rock, where the air itself seemed to carry the weight of cruelty. A crowd had gathered in the square, their voices low, their eyes fixed on the wooden platform where a trembling young girl stood. Her wrists were bound, her dress torn, her face pale with fear. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip. "Who'll start the bidding for this one?" Strong enough to work, young enough to last. The men in the crowd laughed, some spitting tobacco into the dirt, others raising their hands with cold indifference. To them, she wasn't a person, just property. But at the edge of the crowd, leaning against a weathered post, stood a man apart, a cowboy. His hat shadowed his eyes, but the set of his jaw told a story of loneliness, of years spent riding the plains with no one waiting at home. His name was Ethan Cole, and though he had seen his share of hardship, something in the girl's eyes struck him like a bullet to the heart. She wasn't just another soul to be bought and broken. She was fighting to hold on to her dignity, even as the world tried to strip it away. And in that moment, Ethan knew he couldn't let her fate be decided by the vultures circling around her. The bidding began. The auctioneer's hammer slapped against his palm, his voice rising above the restless murmur of the crowd. $50. Who will give me 50? She's young, strong, and worth every cent. The girl's eyes darted across the faces before her, faces that held no mercy. She could see the hunger in them, the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. Her breath quickened, her knees trembling, but she refused to cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. From the back, Ethan Cole shifted his weight, boots grinding against the dirt. He had seen cattle sold, horses traded, even men gamble away their land and pride. But this was different. This was a human soul being bartered like a sack of grain. The bidding climbed. 60, shouted a rancher with a belly that strained against his vest. 70, barked another, his grin wide and cruel. The girl flinched at each number, as though every dollar sealed her fate tighter. Ethan's hand hovered near his belt buckle. He wasn't a rich man. His ranch was small, his herd modest. Every coin he carried had been earned through sweat and solitude. Spending it here would mean sacrifice, supplies left unbought, debts left unpaid. But then her eyes found his, just for a heartbeat. And in that fleeting glance, Ethan saw something that cut deeper than any knife. A plea, not for rescue, not even for kindness, but for dignity, for someone, anyone, to see her as more than a price tag. The auctioneer's voice thundered again. $80, do I hear 90? The crowd roared, the girl's fate tightening like a noose. Ethan's jaw clenched. He could walk away. He could let the world stay cruel, as it always had been. But he knew if he turned his back now, that look in her eyes would haunt him until his dying day. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan stepped forward. The crowd parted, whispers rippling like wind through dry grass. He was a stranger to most, a loner who kept to himself. But now all eyes were on him. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a man who meant every word. $100. The square fell silent. Even the auctioneer blinked, stunned. $100 was no small sum. It was a statement. The girl's lips parted, her breath catching. For the first time that day, a spark of hope flickered in her eyes. The auctioneer grinned, slamming his hammer down. Sold! To the cowboy in the hat! The crowd erupted in murmurs, some mocking, some curious. But Ethan didn't hear them. He walked to the platform, his spurs clinking with each step. and looked up at the girl. Her chains were unfastened, her wrists raw and bruised. She stumbled as she stepped down, but Ethan caught her, steadying her with a hand that was firm but gentle. And then, in a voice that carried across the square, he spoke words that silenced even the cruelest laughter. "You're free now, but hear me well. You'll be my wife." The crowd gasped. The girl's eyes widened, and in that single moment, the course of both their lives shifted forever. The square emptied slowly, but the echoes of Ethan's words lingered in the air like gun smoke after a duel. "You'll be my wife." Some laughed, others muttered, and a few spat into the dirt, cursing his name for spoiling their sport. But Ethan didn't flinch. He simply tipped his hat lower, guiding the girl away from the platform with a steady hand. The girl stumbled beside him, her wrists still raw from the iron shackles. She kept her eyes down, her breath shallow, as though afraid to believe she was truly free. Every step away from that platform felt unreal, like walking out of a nightmare only to find herself in another. They reached his horse, a tall bay gelding, with a scar across its flank. Ethan untied the reins, then turned to her. "Name's Ethan Cole," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of dust and silence. "What's yours?" For a long moment she said nothing, then barely above a whisper, "Clara." Ethan nodded once as though committing it to memory. He helped her into the saddle, his hands careful not to startle her, then swung up behind. With a click of his tongue, the horse moved forward, hooves striking the dirt road that led out of Red Rock. Behind them the town buzzed with gossip. Men muttered about the fool cowboy who wasted $100 on a girl. Women whispered about the scandal of a stranger claiming a wife in such a way. And in the shadows a few bitter eyes followed them with something darker than curiosity, resentment. The trail stretched long and lonely, winding through dry canyons and open plains. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Clara sat stiff in the saddle, her hands gripping the horn, her mind racing. She had been bought before, sold, traded, treated like nothing. But this time was different. This man hadn't looked at her like property. His eyes had been steady, not hungry. His words, though shocking, carried a strange weight of promise. Wife. The word frightened her, yet it also stirred something she hadn't felt in years, the faintest glimmer of safety. Ethan rode in silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He wasn't a man of many words, but his thoughts churned like a storm. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't ridden into town looking for a wife. But when he saw Clara on that platform, something inside him had shifted. He had lived too long with nothing but the wind for company, the walls of his cabin echoing with emptiness. Maybe fate had dealt him this hand. Maybe it was time to stop living like a ghost. As the night settled in, they made camp beneath a cluster of cottonwoods by a narrow creek. Ethan built a fire, its glow casting long shadows across the ground. Clara sat across from him, her arms wrapped around herself, wary but no longer trembling. He handed her a tin cup of water. "Drink. You'll need your strength." She hesitated, then took it, sipping slowly. The firelight flickered in her eyes, revealing both fear and defiance. Finally she spoke, her voice sharper than before. "You say I'll be your wife? But what does that mean to you? Another kind of chain?" Ethan met her gaze, unflinching. "No chains. Not with me. You'll have a roof, food, and a place that's yours. I won't force your hand. But I won't lie either. I don't aim to live alone anymore." Clara studied him, searching for cracks in his words, for the cruelty she had learned to expect from men. But all she found was a tired honesty, the kind that couldn't be faked. The fire popped, sending sparks into the night sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her mind torn between fear of the unknown and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this cowboy was different. And as the flames burned low, Ethan leaned back against his saddle, his hand resting near his revolver. He knew the West was unforgiving, and men in Red Rock didn't forget insults easily. Trouble would come. It always did. But for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt he had something worth protecting. Back in Red Rock, the dust had barely settled when the talk began to spread like wildfire. Men leaned against saloon doors, muttering into their whiskey glasses. Women at the general store whispered behind gloved hands. The story was too strange, too scandalous to keep quiet. A cowboy had bought a girl at auction, then declared her his wife. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others cursed Ethan Cole's name, calling him a fool who had wasted good money. But a few, men who had bid and lost, nursed their anger like a slow-burning coal. They had been denied what they believed was theirs, and in the lawless corners of the West, grudges had a way of turning into bullets. One man in particular, a rancher named Silas Boone, spat into the dirt outside the saloon and swore under his breath. Boone was a man used to getting what he wanted, and he had wanted Clara. To him, Ethan's act wasn't just defiance, it was humiliation, and humiliation demanded payback. Far from town, Ethan and Clara rode on, the night air cool against their faces. The stars stretched endless above them, a blanket of silver over the dark plains. Clara sat quietly in the saddle, her thoughts tangled. She had been taken from one prison, but what awaited her now? This cowboy, this Ethan, had spoken words that still echoed in her chest. "You'll be my wife." Was it a promise or another kind of chain? She stole a glance at him. His face was hard, weathered by sun and wind, but there was no cruelty in it. He rode with the ease of a man who belonged to the land, his hands steady on the reins, his other resting near the revolver at his hip. He hadn't touched her except to steady her when she stumbled. He hadn't spoken much, but when he did, his words carried weight. Still, trust was not something Clara could give easily. Too many times she had been promised safety, only to find betrayal waiting behind it. By the second day, the land began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with mesquite and sagebrush. In the distance, the faint outline of mountains rose against the horizon. Ethan's ranch lay somewhere beyond, a lonely stretch of land carved out of wilderness. They stopped at a creek to water the horse. Clara knelt by the bank, cupping the cool water in her hands, watching her reflection ripple. She barely recognized the girl staring back, eyes hollowed by fear, hair tangled, skin marked by hardship. But beneath it all, there was still a spark, a stubborn ember that refused to die. Ethan crouched nearby, filling a canteen. "You'll find the ranch quiet," he said, his voice low. "Just me, a few cattle, and the land." "It ain't much, but it's honest." Clara looked at him, searching for hidden meaning. "And me? What am I to you truly?" Ethan met her gaze, steady as stone. "You're not property. Not anymore. You'll have a choice in how you live. But I meant what I said. I don't aim to be alone forever. I'll give you a home, if you'll take it." His words hung in the air, simple yet heavy. Clara turned back to the water, her heart torn between suspicion and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this man was different. But even as they spoke, danger was already stirring. Back in Red Rock, Silas Boone gathered two men in the shadows of the livery stable. Their faces were hard, their eyes mean. Boone's voice was low, but filled with venom. That cowboy made a fool of me. Took what was mine. I won't stand for it. We ride at dawn. We'll track him, and when we find him, we'll take the girl back. And as for Cole, Boone's lips curled into a cruel smile. He won't be riding home again. The men nodded, their hands resting on their gun belts. The West was a place where law was thin and vengeance was thick. That night, as Ethan and Clara camped beneath the stars, the fire crackling low, Clara lay awake, staring at the sky. She didn't know that miles behind them, three riders were already on their trail. She didn't know that her freedom and Ethan's life were about to be tested in blood and fire. But she felt it deep in her bones. Trouble was coming, and in the silence of the night, she whispered a prayer she hadn't dared speak in years. God, don't let me fall into darkness again. Ethan, half asleep with his hat pulled low, shifted slightly, his hand never straying far from his revolver. He didn't hear her words, but he felt the weight of them. The West was cruel, but sometimes in the cruelest places, hope found a way to fight back. The morning sun rose red over the plains, casting long shadows across the land. Ethan and Clara rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the steady rhythm of hooves. The air was crisp, but heavy with something unspoken. Clara could feel it in her bones, like the land itself was holding its breath. Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon with the instinct of a man who had lived too long in a world where danger could ride out of nowhere. He didn't say it aloud, but he knew they were being followed. Tracks in the dirt, faint but fresh, had told him as much. Boone and his men were closing in. Clara noticed his silence, the way his hand lingered near his revolver, the way his gaze never rested in one place for long. Finally she spoke, her voice low but edged with fear. Someone's coming, isn't there? Ethan didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the horizon, then finally nodded. Men from Red Rock. Boone, most likely. He ain't the type to let go of a grudge. Clara's stomach tightened. She had seen men like Boone before, men who believed the world owed them whatever they desired, men who would take and take until nothing was left. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. And what will you do when they find us? Ethan's jaw tightened. What I have to. By midday, they reached a stretch of canyon where the trail narrowed between high walls of red stone. The air was still, too still, and Ethan's instincts screamed at him. He pulled the horse to a halt, scanning the ridges above. Stay close, he muttered. Clara's heart pounded. She gripped the saddle horn, her eyes darting nervously. The silence pressed in on her, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Then it came, the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet whined past, splintering rock inches from Ethan's head. Down, he barked, pulling Clara from the saddle and shoving her behind a boulder. Dust filled the air as another shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. From the ridge above, Boone's voice carried down, mocking and cruel. Cole, you think you can steal from me and ride off clean? That girl's mine, and you know it. Ethan crouched low, revolver in hand, his eyes narrowing. She ain't yours, Boone. Never was, Boone laughed, the sound echoing off the stone. Then she's no better off with you. A lonely drifter with nothing but dust in his pockets. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you walk away. Clara pressed herself against the rock, her breath ragged. Fear clawed at her chest, but beneath it burned something else, anger. She had been passed from hand to hand her whole life, treated like a prize to be claimed. And now, once again, men were fighting over her as though she had no voice, no will of her own. She turned to Ethan, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare give me to him. I'd rather die here than go back." Ethan met her gaze, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. He gave a single nod. "Then we fight." The canyon erupted in gunfire. Boone's men opened up from the ridge, bullets sparking against stone. Ethan returned fire, his revolver steady, each shot measured. He moved with the calm precision of a man who had faced death before and learned not to flinch. Clara crouched low, her hands trembling, but her eyes never left him. She saw the way he shielded her with his body, the way he fought not for pride, but for her. One of Boone's men cried out, tumbling from the ridge with a scream that ended in a sickening thud. The other cursed, ducking behind cover. Boone himself snarled, his voice dripping with rage. "You'll regret this, Cole. You hear me? You'll regret the day you crossed me." Ethan fired again, forcing Boone back. The canyon fell silent for a moment, the smoke of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. Then came the sound of retreating hooves, fading into the distance. Boone wasn't finished, but for now he was beaten. Ethan lowered his revolver, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. He turned to Clara, who was still pressed against the rock, her face pale but her eyes fierce. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands still shook. "I'm not used to men fighting for me." Not like that. Ethan holstered his gun, his voice quiet but firm. "I wasn't fighting for you. I was fighting with you." "There's a difference." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. For the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this man wasn't like the others. But as they mounted up and rode on, Ethan's thoughts were grim. Boone had been driven off, but he would return, and next time he wouldn't come with just two men. The trail ahead was long, and blood had already been spilled. The West had a way of testing a person's soul, and Ethan knew theirs was only beginning. The trail wound on for 2 more days, the land growing harsher, lonelier, until at last the horizon broke to reveal a valley carved out of wilderness. Nestled against the foothills stood Ethan Cole's ranch, a modest spread of weathered timber, a corral with a handful of cattle, and a cabin that looked as though it had stood against 100 storms. To Clara, it was no grand estate, no mansion of comfort. But after years of chains, cages, and cold floors, the sight of a roof and smoke curling from a chimney felt almost unreal. She sat in the saddle, staring, her throat tight. Ethan dismounted first, tying the horse to the post. He turned, offering his hand. Clara hesitated, then placed her fingers in his. His grip was firm, steady, but not possessive. He helped her down, and for the first time since Red Rock, she felt her feet touch ground that might, just might, be hers. Inside, the cabin was simple: a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, shelves lined with jars of beans and flour. A rifle leaned against the wall, and a single bed stood in the corner, its quilt patched but clean. Clara's eyes lingered on it, her heart racing. She had been told she was to be his wife. But what did that mean here, in this quiet place? Ethan noticed her hesitation. He set his hat on a peg and spoke in that low, steady voice of his. "You'll take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire until you decide what you want." Clara blinked, startled. "You mean you won't?" He shook his head. "I said you'd be my wife, but that don't mean I'll take what ain't freely given. You'll have time, as much as you need." For a long moment, Clara couldn't speak. No man had ever spoken to her that way. Not as property, not as a prize, but as a person. She turned away, blinking back tears she hadn't allowed herself in years. The days that followed were quiet, almost peaceful. Clara learned the rhythm of the ranch, the feeding of cattle at dawn, the mending of fences, the endless chores that kept the land alive. Ethan worked hard, his hands calloused, his back bent to labor, but he never asked more of her than she could give. At first she kept her distance, speaking little, watching him with wary eyes. But slowly the silence between them softened. She began to cook meals, to sweep the cabin, to hum old songs she barely remembered. Ethan never interrupted, never demanded. He simply listened, as though the sound of her voice was worth more than gold. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Clara stood on the porch, staring at the horizon. Ethan joined her, leaning against the post. For a while they said nothing. Then Clara spoke, her voice quiet. "I don't know how to be a wife. I don't know how to be free." Ethan's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Freedom ain't something you learn in a day. It's something you fight for every sunrise. You'll find your way." She turned to him, searching his face. "And if I can't?" He met her eyes, steady as ever. "Then I'll walk beside you until you do." Her chest tightened, a warmth spreading through her she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe this place, this man, could be the beginning of something new. But peace in the West was always fragile. Miles away in the saloon at Red Rock, Silas Boone nursed his rage with whiskey and venom. His pride had been wounded, his men shamed, and his reputation tarnished. He slammed his glass on the bar, his voice a growl. "Cole thinks he can steal from me and live? He don't know who he's crossed around him." Rough men leaned in, drawn by the promise of violence and coin. Boone's eyes burned with fury as he laid out his plan. "We ride at dawn. Not 3 men this time, 10. We'll burn his ranch to the ground, take the girl, and leave Cole in the dirt where he belongs." The men grinned, their hands eager for gun belts and blood. Boone's hatred had festered into something darker, something that would not stop until Ethan Cole was dead. Back at the ranch, Clara sat by the fire, mending a torn shirt. Ethan sharpened his knife, the steady scrape of steel on stone filling the room. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters. Clara looked up, her voice soft but certain. "They'll come for us, won't they?" Ethan paused, the knife glinting in the firelight. He nodded once. "Boone won't let it go." "Men like him never do." Clara set the shirt aside, her hands trembling. "Then what will we do?" Ethan slid the knife back into its sheath, his eyes hard but calm. "We'll stand. This land is mine. And you—" He looked at her, his voice steady. "You're not theirs to take." The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the walls. Clara met his gaze, and for the first time she felt not just fear, but resolve. She had been running her whole life, but maybe here, with this man, she could finally stop. Outside, the night deepened, heavy with the promise of violence. Somewhere in the darkness, Boone and his riders were already saddling their horses, their hearts set on blood. The reckoning was coming, And when it did, the quiet ranch in the valley would become a battlefield. Dawn broke with the thunder of hooves. Boone and his riders swept down on the ranch, guns blazing, fire in their eyes. Ethan stood firm at the corral fence, rifle in hand, Clara at his side. The fight was fierce, bullets tearing through wood and dust, but Ethan's aim was true. One by one, Boone's men fell or fled, until only Boone remained, snarling like a cornered wolf. He charged, pistol raised, only to be met not by Ethan's bullet, but Clara's defiance. She stepped forward, eyes blazing, and shouted, "I am no man's property." The moment's hesitation was all Ethan needed. His shot rang out, Boone fell, and the valley fell silent. Smoke drifted across the ranch yard. Clara's hands trembled, but she stood tall, no longer the broken girl from the auction block. Ethan lowered his rifle, his gaze steady on her. "It's over," he said quietly. Clara looked at him, then at the land around them, the cabin, the hills, the wide sky. For the first time she felt it. Freedom, not given, not bought, but fought for. She took Ethan's hand, not as a prisoner, not as a bargain, but as a choice. And together, beneath the rising sun, they walked back toward the cabin, toward a life no longer bound by chains, but by hope.